very much indeed. It's a tricky one, this, isn't it? It's a big debate that's raged for, well, how far back do academics go? A long time. I think witches, the term itself, in itself, if we look at the context of particularly early modern history, sort of medieval times up until the 1800s particularly, the term itself is problematic, and problems are going to cause problems. They're going to cause problems, but those problems could be seen as tangents of thought, opposing opinions, sometimes vehemently opposing opinions, causing a catalyst of pain and prosecution, persecution, judgment. These are all kind of brutal words, I think, brutal concepts, wouldn't you agree? Because there's fallout from someone's going to be on the sharp end of those thoughts and feelings and actions. They cause action. I mean, which is which? It's a broad term, and to put witches on trial, there must have been some serious reasons to do that. Be they political or social or religious. We're beginning to see that the whole idea of witches coexisting, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say normal society, if you'll allow me to. I don't like the term really, because what is normal? It's a relative concept. But when we're talking about history, normality seems to be, the received pronunciation of events. This is what happened. The winners wrote it. This is the story that has been received. Anything else that maybe opposes that we might tip a wink at it in history, just to show how great we were, the winners. But we might actually eradicate some of the history that happened, so that the story, root word of history is story, won't be told. Witches were tolerated in medieval Britain as in village life, be they living in the village, be they living in the woods or wherever, or cave, or wherever it is they chose to live. They were cunning folk, men and women. Although the idea of men and women is something that we need to discuss as we go through this timeline of the witch trials, particularly the idea of who copped it the most compared to the other. Not that this was, say we're talking about Europe, where a lot more people were persecuted for witchcraft than happened in Britain, particularly England. Scotland more, atrocious. But Europe tended to, particularly Northern Europe, tended to prosecute the ones that were actually received punishment for being witches. It was deemed illegal to practice witchcraft. They were the people put up under judgment. Were a lot of them were men, and places like Finland, and they were mainly men actually. But here in England, it was women, and that's interesting. And we need to pick up on that as we go through. Be mindful constantly when we go through a timeline of what's happening here. Although you'll hear me burbling on, mainly it'll be women's names that I'm going to be mentioning, and that's in itself will speak for itself. But whoever these cunning folk were, be they men or women, were tolerated as members of society, for they had use and purpose, and they had a presence, and they integrated. They were healers. They cured the sick. They helped people's mental health. If it was they'd talk to you. They'd tell you things. They would find things that had been lost. They could find things that had disappeared. That's useful, isn't it, for most of us? We all lose things. They help people give birth. And then they might also look after the babies too afterwards. And the idea of, it's no mystery that particularly in fairy tales, I'm a storyteller, I'm not a historian by any stretch of the imagination, and that was my dad. But in stories, there's a prevalence in fairy tales of single-parent families that are usually men who are the fathers. The mothers have died because they died in childbirth, and that's true. So the cunning folk, and particularly one would argue that the female cunning folk would look after women when it came to the idea of giving birth and looking after children. But let's not be fooled that they also looked after women not to give birth as well. So the idea of fertility is something that we need to look at from both sides. The idea of preventing fertility or encouraging fertility. And we can talk about academics disagreeing with that and historians finding no evidence for these things, but I think they're feelings to me as a storyteller that just ring true. I mean, particularly if we're talking again about the prevalence of women who are persecuted and prosecuted, particularly in England. So the cunning folk accepted in medieval Britain. There would have been disputes, and there always are between people. People argue, things go wrong, something maybe doesn't turn out the way you wanted it, so you might come back to ostensibly someone offering you a service and saying, I'm not happy with the service, Where is the thing that you're looking for? Where's it gone? Or what's happened to why has my child died? Yeah? What have you done? Yeah? To make that. You can see how it could be problematic and dangerous for a person professing to be someone who can make things happen for you in a way that's not ordinary and requires delicacy, skill, knowledge, cunning, knowing, being able to see, sense. These were those people. And they were members of village society. And they may or may not have integrated well, but something happened that turned them into the sort of witches that became associated with evil, associated with, eventually with Satan, associated with doing something to cause harm, and associated with having to be not tolerated anymore, dobbed on, hoiked on. People can then pretend, even if you weren't a cunning folk, you could accuse someone of being a witch and that would get rid of them. It became a kind of byword for being able to get someone prosecuted, getting someone done in court. So amongst those people hauled in and accused of witchcraft and perhaps prosecuted, some of those wouldn't have been cunning folk or even close to being witches anyway, but may have been accused of being them. So we have to be careful about when we look at the records, which we'll have a look at a few when we comes to the context of Chelmsford and the Essex witch trials. Some of those, mainly women again, probably had no business in that world or any connection with it at all. But we don't know. But it's likely that they did as well. So we need to be careful. Okay. But something happened that turned the cunning folk into those that were suddenly not wanting to be tolerated by society, and they were beginning to get killed and put in prison and punished and encouraged not to keep practicing. Why did the villagers turn against these people suddenly? What was happening in the wider context? What were the drivers behind this? What were the catalysts? And there are many thoughts, and you have your own, and you probably all have your own views about that too. And we'll raise a few tonight and talk about them if you wish. Who knows, we may argue about it. I'm certainly not an authority on those arguments. I'm aware of them, but some of you might be authorities on some of those arguments, and it might be quite interesting if we have time later to hear what you have to say as well, which would be great. Are you with me so far?
Yes.
So the cunning folk, they seem wonderful. I mean, children would have viewed them with a giggle or with distrust or with excitement. They would have been some very unusual people. And where did they come from? And where did they go? They didn't seem to be doing the same things that other people were doing. I'm going to read you a fairy tale, and it's about the adventure that a cunning woman has one night, and how it scars her for life, in a good way and a bad way. Are we ready?
Yeah.
And after this fairy tale, why would anyone ever want to put Dame Goody in the fairy tale under trial? And I'm sure she wasn't, but women like her were. Dame Goody was a nurse. And she looked after sick people. She minded babies. One night, she was woken up at midnight, and she went downstairs. She saw a strange, squinny-eyed little fellow, a little ugly old fellow. He asked her to come to his wife, he was ill. You need to mind the baby. So Dame Goody didn't like the look of the old fellow, but business is... She went along, popped a few things in a bag, a sack, and she went down with him. And he had this huge black horse foaming at the mouth, waiting outside. And in a twinkle, she found herself on the back of the black horse, with the fellow riding through the night. She held on for grin death. They rode and they rode, till at last they stopped before a cottage door. They got out, went in, found that the good woman was abed, with the children playing about. And the baby, the fine bouncing boy, was beside her. So Dame Goody took the baby. At last they... It's a fine baby boy, he'll be fine, you rest. And the mother, when she handed the baby to Dame Goody, she gave her a box of ointment. Mind you, stroke the baby's eyes with it as soon as he opens them. And after a while it began to open its eyes. And Dame Goody saw that the baby had squinny eyes, just like its father. Its father. Perhaps I've given you a clue there. So she took the box of ointment and she... so I'll take the box of ointment from you again there. And she stroked it on the eyelids of the child. But she just came out wondering what was it for. Yeah? She was curious about the ointment. Well, she would be, wouldn't she? She knew all the names of the herbs and the plants, and she knew their purposes, but this was unusual. She wondered what it was. And she thought, well, what could be the harm? I'll just... Left or right? What would you do? Left or right with the eyelid? Your left? Your right? She went for her right eyelid. She was better with her left. And she stroked it on her eyelid, made sure that no one had seen. No sooner had she done so than everything changed about her. The cottage became elegantly furnished. The mother in the bed was a beautiful lady dressed in silk. The little baby was still more beautiful than before, and its clothes were made of a sort of silvery gauze. And its little brothers and sisters around the bed were flat-nosed imps with pointed ears who made faces at one another and scratched their poles. Sometimes they would pull the sick lady's ears with their long, hairy paws. In fact, they were up to all kinds of mischief, and Dame Goody knew that she'd got into a house of pixies. But she said nothing to nobody. And as soon as the lady was well enough to mind the baby herself, she asked the old fellow to take her back home, and off they went, as fast as before, on the coal-black horse, and back home they came. And the squinny-eyed old fellow lifted her down and left her at home, thanked her civilly, paid her more than enough for her services. And then the next day happened to be market day, and Dame Goody had been away from home and she needed things, she was behind. Off to market she trudged. As she was buying the things she wanted, who should she see but the squinny-eyed fellow? What was he doing? Well, he was darting from stall to stall, taking up things from each and not paying for them. Here's some fruit, here's some eggs, and so on, and no one seemed to take any notice. And now Dame Goody did not think it was her business to interfere, But she thought she ought not to let so good a customer pass without speaking, passing the time of day. So she ups to him and bobs a curtsy and says, "Good end, sir. I hope how's your good lady and the little one as well." But she couldn't finish what she was a-saying, for the funny old fellow started back in surprise, and he says to her, he's what? "Do you see me today?" "See you?" says she. "Why, of course I do. As plain as the sun in the skies. And what's more," says she, "I see you are busy too, into the bargain." "Ah, you see too much," said he. "Now, pray, with which eye did you see all this?" "With the right eye, to be sure," said she, as proud as can be to find him out. "The ointment! The ointment!" cried the old pixie thief. "Take that for meddling with what don't concern you. You shall see no more." And with that he struck her on the right eye, and she couldn't see him any more. And what was worse, she was blind on the right side from that hour till the day of her death. A cunning woman, Dame Goody, but got into a scrape. But certainly that fairy tale illustrates the kind of world that person may have inhabited, and the strange things that may have occurred to those who could see, those cunning folk who could see and feel the things that the ordinary folk could not. So why did they start ending up being persecuted? I asked that question again, and I think let's try and find a way of answering it, or at least illustrating perhaps the reasons why. In 1486, towards the end of the medieval period, a certain book was published, written by a German scholar, in inverted commas. He was, I suppose he was a witch phobe. He was phobic. He hated the idea of, perhaps he hated the idea of cunning folk. He hated the idea of anything to do with it. He wrote a book called Malleus Maleficarum. It became an international bestseller of the day. It was the most published book for, I think, the following sort of 200 years, almost as well published and distributed as the Bible at the time. And it was reprinted throughout, 100 years. I forget, and it finally got into the midst of the likes of Matthew Hopkins and the Witchfinder General and the Witchfinders of that period. They kind of used it as a handbook to kind of rat out witches and sense them, and the sort of things that the book guided them to look out for, which were pretty solid, and proved beyond reasonable doubt for them that anything they were doing was linked with Satan. It was anti-Christ, it was anti-establishment. So, it was known as the Hammer of Witches in England, the book. So it really had a real weighty kind of purpose, this book. It really opened the floodgates for finding witches and exterminating them. Well, that really was the point of the book, how to find them and exterminate them. That's pretty strong, isn't it, compared to the cunning folk enjoying village life, suddenly being turned in, well, you can see for yourself that works there. But beyond that, time passed, and in 1542, in England, under the glorious reign of Henry VIII, when people shout dates at me, it means nothing. I think the idea of, maybe you're the same, but Henry VIII was on the throne, he of 6 wives, and all of the developments that were happening in society there. He was arguing with the establishment of Europe, particularly the Roman Catholic Church. There was so much happening there, but under his reign, the Witchcraft Act was passed, which defined witchcraft as a crime punishable by death. And 5 years later, it was repealed. And then later, in 1563, some would argue 1562, in the glorious reign of good Queen Bess, Elizabeth I was on the throne. Shakespeare was writing plays. Explorers and adventurers were forming colonies and bringing back exotic goods. The great powers of Europe were struggling for who had access to the great spice routes of the East. Spain was plotting invasion of England. And at this point, the Witchcraft Act 1563 against conjurations, enchantments, and witchcrafts introduced the death penalty for sorcery. Sorcery that specifically would cause the death of someone, of a person. You were okay if you caused the death of an animal, even though that was anathema to the mainly rural population of England, where livestock and crops and things happening to those very important parts of their life would have been catastrophic for them. But if a witch was found to have caused the death of a person, then they would be executed. They would be hanged. They wouldn't be burnt. That was the crime for treason. But if, say, a witch was found to have murdered her husband, that was known as petty treason, and they could burn a witch, but not as a witch, as a murderer of husband. So witches would be hanged. And there would be a year in prison, hard labour, with pillorying, so being put in the stocks of some sort and humiliated in public, as part of that year's punishment for minor sorcery offences that didn't involve the death of a person. Great, nice one. So that's Elizabethan England, the Renaissance, yeah. All those developments in education, in science, in literature, in music, in warfare, in trading, in economics. Suddenly it was now deemed that these cunning folk who had become, in the eyes of the world, witches, and connected loosely now, thanks to Malleus Maleficarum, with the idea of evil, were not particularly welcome, particularly if they were causing the death of an individual. 200 years before, the Great Plagues had decimated Europe. Whole villages had emptied. Millions and millions of people had died. It was probably a good time to try and encourage female fertility at that time and make sure that the societies and villages were repopulated. But by this time, this act of 1563, the population was living pretty healthy, actually. There was no reason to kind of rat out witches for causing infertility or stopping women from being able to conceive, i.e. being in control of their own kind of sexuality and what they wanted to do with that. There would be no real reason, and there was no real evidence that a growth in population at that time had any correlation with the amount of witch trials. It just so happened it was an intense period of witch trial and witch finding. It was an incredibly surprising time, and it intensified as time went on. You could be tried for a witch now, and had to be, in a secular court. Before, yes, there were incidences of witches being punished or tried, but this was by the church. They were deciding whether that was the case or not. But now, it was illegal. It was a legal offence, and you were tried in the courts of the time, in the assizes. Is everyone okay with the term? The assizes were the periodic courts that happened across the country in England. London had its own thing going, but the assizes, the rest of the counties had their own circuit of periodic courts and certain places where the court gathered. And there was a circuit called the Home Circuit, and that was the home counties, which included Essex. And Chelmsford was the place where the assizes gathered, where the judges came twice a year to hear the pertinent trials of the day. So under this act, this was how witches were tried at the assizes, and the communities of the home counties that made up of the home circuit, including Kent and cross over to London, to Kingston, and they would store up the accusations until it was time to bring them in front of the judges. So people could have been rounded up and put in prison in the cages, waiting for some time, maybe waiting, until the seasons changed, until summer came, or until Lent arrived, when so-and-so, Judge so-and-so would be appearing and dispensing justice. So a whole kind of horrific kind of feeling of waiting for a fate. And if judgment was passed, it would be pretty quick, that you'd be either indicted or found guilty, and sentence would be carried out. In certain cases, particularly in Chelmsford, 2 hours later people were hung. And it was in South Primrose Hill, ostensibly, where if you were hung in Chelmsford, that's where it happened at this period. And a surprising amount of people were hung there. I think throughout the period of the 16th and 17th centuries, the intense witch trial period, it's about 100 people, isn't it, were hung in Chelmsford. And during a really intense period, about 19 people were hung in one day. But over the whole of the country, it was only about 500 people throughout the whole period of witch persecution under these acts that were actually executed in England. So here in Essex, it's quite a high proportion we're hearing already compared to that national figure. What prompted this area, particularly around the home counties, to actually accuse so many people? And so many people in Essex particularly were ratting on their neighbours and putting people forward, and often it would be a very intense local kind of accusation. It would be neighbours and people 2 miles away. No further. It would be whole villages. There would be a kind of intensity, a kind of intimacy about hysteria. That's a good word. I think that's very true. But hysteria, closeness. If we look at the wider picture of what was happening at the time, yes, the great bubonic plagues had happened, but now we had other things happening too. We had the threat of sweating sickness over the Elizabethan, Tudor, and into the Stuart period. And sweating sickness was no joke at all. It would polish you off very, very quickly indeed. So particularly if we think about Elizabethan England at this point of where we're at with the Act, people were ostensibly living under quarantine conditions, which is a familiarity to all of us from recent history, our own experiences. And they're not easy times, are they? They're certainly not. They're not times where anything strange happening or out of the ordinary, when something very, 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 very catastrophic is happening in the wider context. It's going to actually ruffle feathers even more, I would argue. People looking for reasons for why it's so bad, and looking for scapegoats. It doesn't surprise me in the slightest that anyone living vaguely outside the norm of that society could be easily accused of being the perpetrators of whatever bad things were happening to people generally, let's say in that village or in that street. So people were accusing each other left, right and centre. And yes, Essex was a particular hub of accusation, and therefore people coming to court, and a very high number of people being prosecuted, which is being found guilty, and a very high number of those being executed, and in comparison to the national kind of picture. Again, the question why begins to ring through my head, even if I'm reacting to the material now. Later, Elizabeth, it evolves into James I appearing from Scotland. He didn't like witches very much. In fact, he was busy accusing Scottish nobles of being witches and making sure that kind of saw to their claim to the very, very turbulent Scottish crown wars, which were a constant battle between a series of clans and families, the Stuarts winning out eventually and then taking England too. But the Stuarts started off very, very humbly actually. Well, not relatively humbly, but they were stewards in armies. They were the stewards who would be looking after the supplies and making sure the tents and all the kind of the details, the nitty-gritty stuff was feeding an army, for an army can only be efficient. It marches on its stomach. So the stewards were very, very important. They were so important they became very ambitious and eventually became kings. So they knew every trick in the book. But James I was witch-phobic. He had a horror of witches. He wrote his own book as well to contribute to the whole idea of trying to find and exterminate witches. Not surprisingly, a new Witchcraft Act emerged in 1603 and under his 1604 under his reign, and it wasn't much different to the previous act. He just added the bit that said the act was reformed to include anyone to have made a pact with Satan. So if you were a witch, you were immediately making a pact with Satan, so therefore that was you, okay? And you would be found guilty if that could be proved. Therefore, anything the cunning folk happened to be doing, even if they weren't considered witches by their villages, would be considered witches by their villages, and would be considered all the good work that they were doing, the Dame Goody work, the buzzing around, even if it's for pixies, looking after children, all of those positive things was deemed satanic and therefore punishable. Punishable by death, with the same sort of gradient of minor offences, which were imprisonment, pillorying, and the rest of which they'd become quite used to doing at this point. Again, tried in the assizes. Oh, and this, of course, extended to the colonies of America, and under that particular act, the 1604 amendment, it paved the way for the great witch trials of America, the Salem witch trials, the Virginia witch trials, the Massachusetts witch trials, which were intense, but not really seemingly as intense as the activity here in Essex, which seems to trump in terms of if we're looking to trump in any way. The numbers and the intensity of the trials and the amount of people that went through those trials was more here than over there. Then as time passed, it took till 1735. That's who was on the throne? George II. Okay? The Hanoverians were on the throne. The second of four of them. That's when finally hysteria had dissipated. The idea of that way of thinking had dissolved and had become just not irrelevant and a bit ridiculous. The voices in Parliament, this is absurd. This is absurdity. This needs to stop. So the Witchcraft Act of 1735 was introduced, which made it a crime for a person to claim that any human being had magical powers. Okay? Or it made it a crime to be guilty of practicing witchcraft, but effectively the law abolished the hunting and execution of witches in Great Britain. That stopped. And the maximum penalty for any of the offences under that act was a year's imprisonment. So out went the execution of accused witches, and increased the prosecution of people pointing the finger. Because if you were aware that someone was practicing magic, that was an offence to say it. Okay, so that kind of quashed it, and that led eventually to 1824. Who was on the throne? George IV, okay, passing the Vagrancy Act. And it's a tenuous link, but the Vagrancy Act also mentions it was an offence to be caught practicing fortune-telling, astrology, and spiritualism. These were all punishable offences. That's a whole different talk, I think, the idea of the Vagrancy Act and what was happening at the time, and the things that were happening in society, the advent of the railway, clearing up of the countryside, the tightening up of those laws, persecution of the Romanes. There was all sorts going on there. There's an author called George Borrow that you may come across who talks a lot about that through fiction and sort of autobiographical fiction. The police force was also invented at that time to help enforce the Vagrancy Act. So it's kind of an exciting period of history, but also one that raises kind of heckles and questions too. But I think it's kind of linked, really, that idea of the fortune tellers, and they're finally being kind of quashed out of society. Any connection with the whole idea of witchcraft has been moved away and swept under the carpet. That's the context. Is that, are we with me? With me still? Should we zero in a little with our camera lens and focus down to the point of why we're here, I think, which is the witch trials of Essex, which is a byword for the witch trials of Chelmsford, really. And let's not set off here on the wrong foot, which is to say that all of the witches that were tried here at Chelmsford were from Chelmsford. No, they weren't. They were from all around the home counties that were part of the home circuit. But we will zero in on a few people who were prosecuted in the contiguous villages around Chelmsford, and because Chelmsford didn't technically exist, did it, folks? It was a series of parishes and villages. The Essex Assizes up and running twice a year. People waiting in cages to be prosecuted. Let's look at a snapshot. Under Elizabeth I. Let's go back to Elizabethan times. Again, invest yourself in the idea of theatre and science and the Renaissance and wonderful things happening in Elizabeth. Espionage being invented in the whispered, dark corners of court. All these very exciting things happening. Great travel and discovery and Walter Raleigh and hey ho. It's a vibrant period of history. I'd have absolutely loved to have lived at that point, as you can probably tell. That was probably that would have been great. As a child, waking up and realising, I think I was born in the wrong time, Mum. Live with it, find a way of kind of coming to terms with that. Let's look at the Elizabethan period, and particularly, I think it would be interesting to look at those people found guilty under the Act at the time. And thank you very much to a local historian, Peter Wells, who was generously introduced to me briefly over email by our own Alan here. For his generosity, I thank you. Which negates the whole point of the title of my talk, which claimed that in 1566 the first witch was prosecuted and hanged. And it happened a year before. There was a witch in Great Waltham who was the first, and not particularly lauded or mentioned in the pamphlets that survived from that period, which have given us the evidence of the names and some of their lives and what they did and their reasons for being prosecuted, of which we'll have a look at a few now if you wish. But it was an Elizabeth Lewis of Great Waltham who was the first to be found guilty under the Act, and she was hanged for causing the death of a... What did the Act say? Had to be a person. It could have been a baby. Yes, exactly that. It was, in fact. Yeah. But then in 1566 things pick up, and we have some goings on in Hatfield Peveril. Anyone here from Hatfield Peveril? Anyone been to Hatfield Peveril? Been through Hatfield Peveril? There was an interesting group of women here because they all appear to be related. It can't be exactly proved, but certainly it's very, very clear that some of them were. There was a kind of dynasty of witches here. The idea of a mother figure, a grandmother figure, passing on her wisdom and her skills to the daughters yet to come, and then it being passed down the line. And it seemed that this family in particular were acquiescent. They kind of accepted the responsibility of that and cherished that, and then practiced and then handed down to their daughters. Not the case in every family, I'm sure. Some people would have not. But this bunch did, and it was to their detriment. Their matriarchal figure in this, the name of Mother Eve, she She had a few scrapes with the law, but it's not recorded that she was prosecuted at all or punished. But her daughters were. And here we have Elizabeth Frances and Agnes Waterhouse. And Agnes is the most exciting story because she's the one that's claimed to be the first ever to be prosecuted under the Act. We now know it's not. It's our Waltham lass, the unfortunate Elizabeth Lewis. But both of those women were hanged. No, Elizabeth actually had a year in prison. She confessed, but she only bewitched someone. Someone hadn't died. But Agnes Waterhouse caused the death of a person, so was hanged. A year later, we had Alice Prestbury, she had Alice Atram, bewitching a horse and pig, bewitching a person, years in prison, with pillorying. 1569, Alice Swallow was hanged for the death of a person and had a conjuration. Elizabethan England. You know? William Skelton, a male, in 1572, along with his wife, Marjorie, were both hanged for the death of a person. Catherine Pullin, Elizabeth Frances crops up again from Hatfield Peveril. She hasn't learnt her lesson, it seems, or isn't refusing to stop practising doing whatever it is she's doing. She crops up again and manages to get off with, again, a year in prison for bewitching a person. Usually, if you were caught twice, what would happen? You get hanged, yeah, absolutely. But somehow Elizabeth Frances manages to escape the noose for her second offence. But it didn't. She was caught a third time and was eventually hanged. It's almost a sort of, I'm delivering it almost like a sort of black comedy, because in lots of ways, funny things are often the best way of expressing absolute tragedy. They're very linked. The flip side of the coin, I think, humour is often used very well to kind of dispel tension, I think, and a rising bile of anger. I think it's the best way of trying to filter it sometimes. And the list goes on. 1572 is a very, very popular year for hanging and prosecuting witches. 1574, Alice Chandler hanged, Cecilia Glastonbury hanged, Elizabeth Taylor, not the Elizabeth Taylor, hanged. I mean, that would be, gosh, Alice Hinkson got a year because she caused one of the cattle to die. Again, we're back to the idea here that these were important things to the rural population, you know. The cattle and the crops, this was disastrous, and population was increasing, there were mouths to feed. It'd be quite convenient to get rid of more people, actually. Maybe there was a case for older women not having a use in their village, less mouths to feed, who knows? I mean, this is all hearsay, but scapegoatery is afoot. I can smell it. It's rife. It needs proving, and I think without solid historical proof, it would never be accepted into history books. But the feeling around it, the kind of almost the storyteller's instincts, the human instincts, is that there's something not quite meeting the eye here. And people were basically, it was neighbours and next door neighbours and minor friends of these individuals that were actually pushing them towards the courts and accusing them as the victims, accusing. And they were brought in, and there were star witnesses, and they had their say, and occasionally they would be backed up by the clergy as well, who were quite happy to endorse the witnesses' statements and back up with some gravitas the sense of enormity and seriousness of the situation. So that was a snapshot of Elizabethan trials in Chelmsford. It's the feeling of how they must have felt actually waiting occurs to me as being particularly poignant. I'm going to read you a quick extract from a book from an Essex author, if I may. And it's published as a children's book, but it's got children's books are wonderful. I still reread most of the children's books that I read as a child. Are you rereaders as well, or are you kind of, I can do it once and then I'll move on? And the same with films. This maybe gives us a clue as to why I'm a storyteller. Obsessed with it. This is a book called A Pinch of Magic by Michelle Harrison. And we join an accused witch gazing out of a window, imprisoned in a cage. A cage being a holding word, a prison of some sort. Originally, they would have been cages, but there would have been more solid structures then. I don't know, in Chelmsford, I'm sure there were many locations of cages. I think there were a few in older maps that you can find out and look for. Yes, there was a house that was the cage. Yeah, yes, and it's still standing. Have you?
Yeah.
The prisoner gazed out of her window. It was one of 4 in Crowstone Tower, the tall stone cage in which she was being held. Here, if she kept her eyes up, she could pretend that the prison walls far below did not exist, and that she was looking upon the world from a castle or perhaps a mountain. But today she was done with make-believe, pretending she was in a dream, pretending someone was going to save her. The girl wrapped her arms more tightly around herself against the cruel wind that whipped through the bare windows. The windows were not barred, they didn't need to be. The height of the tower was deterrent enough. She'd never meant to hurt anyone. Pale red moon had appeared in the sky yesterday, which had set all the warders' tongues wagging. A red moon was a blood moon, sign that wrongdoing was afoot. She stared across at Crowstone to the crossroads. There the gallows were being prepared at this very moment, her last journey anywhere. She would be shackled in irons, of course, which reputedly rendered witches powerless, but even the most fearless warder would be unsettled to be near her once she was out of the tower, especially under a blood moon. I never meant to hurt anyone, she whispered, gripping the sill with numb fingers. It was true. She hadn't wanted to cause anyone harm then. But now, revenge was all she could think of. And she would have it, even though she knew it would not save her. Yeah. And even if your thoughts of revenge, regret, guilt, I just can't imagine that. Maybe it was better to be kind of dealt with 2 hours after being sentenced as opposed to waiting. Yeah. I can't imagine. I'm sure you'd have your own views on either or, but so that was Michelle Harrison, an Essex author, giving us a little insight into how they must have felt. There were 4 surviving pamphlets from this era of the snapshot that I just gave you earlier of some of those names. And the 4 pamphlets describe in some detail some of the lives, sometimes the loves, actually, of these individuals who were going under trial. And it certainly described the circumstances surrounding their prosecution and what became of them. Would you like to look at a few? Yeah. Have you heard of any of these names before? Elizabeth Francis, yeah. She of Hatfield Peveril, we assume sister. It's a tenuous link, but they lived next door, her and Agnes Waterhouse. Agnes being Elizabeth being the confirmed grandchild of Mother Eve, the cunning folk who began the Hatfield Peveril clan. Now, we'll look at Elizabeth, I think, particularly, and then we can move on. Under pre-trial questioning, I'm going to quote from the pamphlet, that's fine with everyone. She said that she was given a white spotted cat named Satan by her grandmother Eve. She renounced God and his word and was told to give her blood to the cat. So this is Eve telling her that that's what she has to do. And later she asked the cat for sheep and to procure her a rich husband. Unfortunately, when the cat prevailed upon her to have sex with the favoured man, he had not married her. And she told the cat to kill him. Fearing pregnancy, she asked the cat for help with abortifacient herbs. And then, at its insistence, attempted once again to win a husband by what the pamphlet labels fornication. In this attempt she succeeded, but later marital unhappiness prompted her to kill the resultant child and to lame her husband, whom trials record as the name of Christopher Francis, and her story was printed in the Examination and Confession of Certain Witches at Chelmsford in the county of Essex, 1566. Poor thing. Well, she She managed to get away with not being hung on that occasion, and spent a year in prison. And then in 1572 she was tried again as a witch, as her second offence. Again, escaped the death penalty, as we've mentioned earlier. And in 1579 her luck ran out, and she was tried, convicted and hanged for killing a neighbour, name of Alice Poole, by witchcraft. She pleaded not guilty, but had confessed the offence in a pre-trial examination, which appears in the second Essex pamphlet, a detection of damnable drifts practised by 3, actually 4, witches arraigned at Chelmsford in Essex. This pamphlet title. Frances said that she'd killed Poole with the help of a dog spirit because Poole refused to give her some yeast. And if we look at other similar examples in the pamphlet, they're all of similar ilk in the sense that either they're sort of connected with some sort of sexual motive, having been maligned and then using powers to try and achieve the end result of a desire. And certainly in most cases it's a neighbour or someone very close by who's been somehow affronted within that framework of behaviour, who's pointed the finger and made sure it's come to trial. Villagers prosecuting villagers, people they've grown up, their own kind, chopping them in. Same with Joan Waterhouse, who was Agnes Waterhouse's daughter. She got hold of a familiar spirit through the name of Satan. It seemed the Hatfield-Peveril clan had this link that seemed to be prevalent, as the pamphlets tell us. They all eventually, although Joan managed to escape prosecution, certainly her mother, her aunt, didn't. And that was the Hatfield-Peveril witch family. It can't exactly be proved that they're all related, but they're near as damn it. They live next door. They're in the same square, 10 metres of their life that they shared together. We have others further afield in Malden, and Elaine Smith was tried and hanged in Chelmsford in 1579 for killing a child. Again, this offence seems to be cropping up, very similar kind of language coming up in the pamphlets. Quarrels with men, quarrels with other women, quarrels about asking for charity or through poverty wanting some sort of economic benefit and being refused it by a neighbour, and that then being the reason to bewitch them. The kind of social contexts are beginning to emerge here in the village life of this period. It was actually hard times. There were too many mouths to feed, and a very kind of insular kind of parochial existence within villages. And they ended up here in Chelmsford being tried and accused. And as we know from I said earlier, about 100 of them hanged here for causing deaths, for major offences. Are you with me so far? Why? I mean, as time goes on, 1645, we're approaching civil war. We're about to get rid of Charles I as king. The Puritan Protestant movement is gaining strength. People are emerging, buoyed by the 1603 Act, saying that anything to do with witches is satanic. That gives us free license to begin hunting in earnest, waving copies of the medieval book claiming, how to find and destroy witches. Off comes the Witchfinder General, self-proclaimed Matthew Hopkins, and his cronies, scouring the countryside, feverishly looking for witches. And no wonder there was a period of intense kind of prosecution and execution here in Chelmsford because of those men and their findings. And they do say approximately 19 were hung in one day by Hopkins, or the findings of Hopkins led to those hangings. Go to Admiral's Park. There's a plaque there, isn't there? Have you been? You've seen just near pretty much the site, and give or take, 100 metres. The site of South Primrose Hill, I think, is now debatable. I think it's probably gone, hasn't it? It's been paved over, but it's very, very close to that place where they would have made a journey from the assizes, which would have been presumably up where the high street is now. They would have had to have made a journey all the way out there, which is a fair step actually, isn't it? I'm a stroller, a strider, and it's a kind of 5 to 8 minute stride for me, but it's a 15-minute to 20-minute totter for someone in irons, maybe longer, maybe an hour, with people there lining the streets watching. I'm sure it would have been a spectator sport. Horrific. The things that would have been said and things that would have been thrown. Just dreadful. Absolutely dreadful. So why were these people persecuted generally? I mean, we've spoken of sexual motives, poverty, unneighbourliness, refusal to do business. We spoke at the very beginning of say, the cunning folk, business is business, as Dame Goody said. If that business goes wrong, there's cause to try and get someone accused of something they haven't done. There are many, many motives. Maybe in some ways it tells us more about the victims than the actual ones who were accused. Perhaps their perception of what was happening was skewed, and perhaps they had other motives too for getting rid of individuals in their environ, in their close quarters of their village. Who knows? There are so many factors. But questions are raised. Was it people's appearance? Certainly in the later witch finders were using witches' marks and exploring them with torture methods to prove that people were witches. But there's no real evidence that most of the witches prosecuted had some sort of witchy kind of, witch literature. How literature even at the time was describing witches didn't reflect the actual evidence of the pamphlets and the court trials. Some of the Essex witches were lame, but none were sort of the sort of language, the sort of that perception of what witches are supposed to look like. But I think it might be time for me to do a quick reading for you, just to imply, perhaps, what may also have been something behind why these women were prosecuted, particularly women, because we're talking sort of 95% of witches in England were women, persecuted. Rhiannon Lucy Cosslett of The Guardian wrote in 2009 in an essay that's or an article about literature and about witches in literature, which is very, very interesting. But she had a few choice things to say, which I'd like to share with you, if I may. She states, "A witch is a woman who has too much power," or, to quote the novelist Madeline Miller, "a woman with more power than men have felt comfortable with. History teaches us that witches are dangerous, must be brought down, punished, silenced. Their wisdom and their force must be neutralized through interrogation, torture, and execution. Yet these attitudes aren't merely historical. Women continue to be persecuted for witchcraft in the world today. There's been a perennial literary fascination with witches. They are, as Maren Gibson, Professor of Renaissance and Magical Literatures at Exeter University, says, they're a shorthand symbol for persecution and resistance, misogyny and feminism in particular. And of course, the literary witch is nothing new. She has existed since storytelling began, from Circe, the first witch in Western literature, to Hecate, or Hecate, Morgan Le Fay, Baba Yaga, the Weird Sisters, the Wicked Witch of the West, and Hermione Granger. At their worst, literary witches are stereotypical and derivative. At their best, they are symbols of resistance against patriarchy and the harnessing of feminine power. So, certainly Rhiannon kind of agrees with where I'm leaning to when I look at all of the, or sense and feel, the idea that maybe this idea of fertility, of being able to help women bear children and not bear children, maybe that something there lies the rub. Maybe that idea that repopulating after plague was a necessity, therefore fertility was encouraged, and those who could give you the keys to not conceiving children would have to be harnessed. And then maybe in a growing population where there was too much fertility, it might have been quite handy to stop those women who could encourage childbirth and look after children from being part of village life too. Perhaps. But academics would shout at me, they would tear me down for having no evidence for that. And even some feminists would agree with that too, saying that that's hokum. But it lends me to believe that the root of what's happening here has to be intolerance, has to be the idea that someone who isn't perceived as normal, and because of that, can be accepted and danced with and played with, and they can coexist with them, and it's all fine, and it's tolerant. You know, this is wonderful and celebrated. This wonderful person who isn't living within the norms of our society is someone to be celebrated. But that can also be dependent on who you're living with and where you're living and who the people are surrounding you, because the complete opposite can also happen, where those not so ordinary people can be deemed to be not ordinary and eradicated because of it. So the idea of tolerance and intolerance, and the idea of fertility and good and bad, are flip sides of one very, very thin coin. And that, I think, is probably the root of the witch trials in Essex too. And still continues. This day in society, we still need to keep working hard at our tolerance levels and our acceptance. Thank you very much indeed. Too much material. There's loads out there, everyone. I've got reams and reams of the stuff. It's quite easy to find too, if you want to pursue even more. I'm sure some of you, and I know some of you here, already have. And thank you to Patch for hosting, and thank you Paul McLean. Thank you the Heritage Open Week. Thank you the Civic Society of Chelmsford. Thank you Ellie for spreading the word so quickly. Thank you Rebecca for the spark, the flame and the fuel. Thank you Peter for that document that changed the course of my thinking when it came to this idea. And thank you for coming.
Yeah.